As the American debt bubble continues to grow, it may be time to consider the ancient practice of debt jubilee. All right, guys, hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we got a really interesting topic. We're going to be running through this article right here. When debts become unpayable, they should be forgiven. An interview with Michael Hudson. For centuries, debt and indebtedness have had profoundly destabilizing effects on human societies. In the ancient world, rulers and their subjects had a solution known as the Debt Jubilee. It involved a periodic, unconditional wiping out of debt. We need such a jubilee today. Now, for those of us living in the United States, the reality of debt is nothing new to us. It's no mystery that damn near every citizen in this country, from rich to poor, is saddled with an incomprehensible amount of debt. Here in the United States, you need to acquire debt to get a higher education. You need to acquire a large sum of debt to get a reliable vehicle. You oftentimes, if you go to the hospital, you end up, even for the most minor thing, if you're already having a hard time making ends meet, you end up with an astronomical amount of debt. God forbid you have a serious procedure or chronic illness. In the U.S., debt isn't just a single issue. In the U.S., debt is a way of life. Really, having substantial wealth that can be compounded relies on your ability not to not have debt, but to be able to acquire large sums of debt. Okay? Debt in the United States is, as I said, your way of getting health care. It is your way of getting transportation. It is your way of moving up the social ladder. We have in the United States, and I imagine some other Western countries, a credit score. Now, credit score isn't how good your finances are per se. It is a credit rating which determines if you are allowed to get more debt. As I said, debt is a way of life in this country. This sort of debt culture that I'm talking about is something that has been building for decades, for generations. And it's a result of a lot of things that we won't all get into here, but namely the large amount of debt, the lines of cheap credit that we've seen with things like credit cards, auto loans, loans for your education, et cetera, et cetera. Cheap credit came about as a result of declining standards of living, declining real wage in the United States. As real wages continued to collapse, as the price of living continued to go up, but wages did not keep up with it, one of the most profound and ingenious, really, ways that the American capitalist system came up with keeping the bubble growing, keeping the economy running despite the fact that no one's able to buy its products anymore, was to foster cheap credit. Extend a line of credit to anyone and anybody who is willing to sign on the dotted line. Because the reality is this: most Americans cannot afford the American dream anymore. Even, middle class people. Middle class isn't real. Middle class is just that the bank trusts you enough to loan you money to pay for things that you could never afford in a million fucking years with your regular wage. That's what it means to be middle class. It is this line of debt, this line of cheap credit, this line of credit cards that keeps us able to spend. That is the only thing that is keeping the American economy afloat. Literally, our entire economy is built on debt, from the national and the federal level, where the government, in order to continue financing programs in its military spending, borrows from other countries, borrows from, God knows, Switzerland, China, all of it. All the way down to littlest person, to littlest, I got to get a Christmas present, so I better, ask my bank and maybe they'll run me a line for an extra $1,000 on my credit card. Every single aspect of the American economy, from healthcare to transportation to corporations, such a large number of corporations anymore are what are known as zombie corporations, where the amount of debt that they owe is exponentially larger than the amount of revenue they bring in. Everything, every aspect of the American economy is built on debt. And that is a terrifying place to be in. And we'll get into why that is more in a little while. But some more statistics I have here from debt. I was trying to do some research on this, and I swear to God, when you're trying to get specific statistics, it can be so difficult sometimes, because obviously some of the mainstream news media outlets just push bullshit. They give you a false narrative. At best, they sugarcoat the issue so that people don't freak out about how bad it actually is. But I listened to a lot of On Contact on Russia Today with Chris Hedges. If you don't know who Chris Hedges is, please look him up. You should not be listening to my show. You should be listening to Chris Hedges. But I was listening to one of his shows about a debt collective, about people starting to join a debt collective where they are now joining together to refuse to pay their debts. But anyway, let me go on with a couple of these statistics here for you. It says student debt is over $1.7 trillion. Personal debt is over $14 trillion. That's your credit cards and all that bullshit. 87 million U.S. residents lack adequate health care coverage, meaning that they will acquire more debt if something bad happens with their health. 40% cannot afford an unexpected $400 expense. I count myself lucky that I am not one of those. But I tell you what, an expense for a couple of G's, I'm fucked, and that can happen easily, and I bet a lot of you are in the same boat. 62% of personal bankruptcies in the U.S. are linked to illness and healthcare costs. Great. Don't get cancer. It's going to fuck you over if you survive it. We got a few more here for you guys. 40 million U.S. citizens live in poverty, including more than 40% of all children. Going along with why we have all this debt, because nobody can afford to live. The priorities of a country, imagine the priorities of a country that allows 40% of their children to be in the poverty line, under the poverty line. See it right there? 40% of children in poverty. 50% of all U.S. workers live paycheck to paycheck. Generally, I am part of that. Thank God for tax season, because I'd be doing the same motherfucking boat right now. 12% experience food insecurity and hunger. Nearly 1 in 5 renters were unable to pay their landlord's regular monthly installments in 2017. That's before the pandemic. Much worse now. Much worse now. 10 to 14 million households are so far behind on their rent payments during the pandemic, they face the danger of being evicted. 10 to 14 million new homes for BlackRock to buy up. That's going to be great for the rent prices too, ain't it? But yeah, guys, there's a few statistics I have for you about just how bad the debt crisis is in this country. Like I said, it's more than just one of the massive issues in our country, perhaps the biggest issue there is, and it's directly related to wealth inequality. It's beyond just an issue. As I said, it's a way of life. We have a culture of debt. If you can run up a lot of debt, man, that means you're doing good. And that's a scary thought. Yes, the culture of debt. And before we get into this article, I'm going to start reading here for you guys. I got one more statistic for you. Americans owe all this debt, right? Trillions upon trillions of dollars of debt, from personal to healthcare related to auto, etc. That debt is owed to somebody. You know, on the national level, when the government is doing their shopping, so to speak, it goes to other countries. China owns a large portion of our debt. I believe Japan also owns a large portion of our debt. But all this other debt is owed to somebody. I think we all know who owns it. The giant financial corporations, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Chase, blah, blah, blah. You know them. They fucking tanked our economy in 2008, and somehow they're even bigger than before. So all this debt is owed to them. Americans have so much debt and are trying to pay off so much debt to these private financial corporations that the statistic that I came up with says that 8 out of every $10 Americans produce as a whole, generally, evened out, average, 8 out of every $10 we produce as working people goes to the top 1%, namely those in financial corporations. 8 out of every $10. Now, it's interesting because if somebody ran up in my house and pointed a gun in my face and said, "I'm going to need 80% of everything you have and I'll let you keep 20 because I'm a decent thief. I'm a nice thief. I'm not going to leave you with nothing." You know, I'd call that what it is. He's not a kind thief because he's stealing from me even though he's leaving me with 20%. $2 out of every 10. A thief's a thief. I'll call that what this is. Because they have lowered wages, because they have lowered the social wage, because they have stripped benefits, public amenities, all these things that are meant to help people. You now, in order to afford to live a basic standard of living in the U.S., have to hand over 8 out of every $10 you produce to a banker, a fucking thief. And I don't even know how we can justify that. And I suppose the only reason why we are able to justify it is because people don't realize that. They don't realize that on average, 8 out of every $10 that we produce as working people goes to these giant corporations. I mean, why the fuck do you think these people are, sailing around the world and flying islands? Or floating islands? Fucking super yachts. Why they got 100 houses? They got a fucking warehouse full. It's because they stole all of it. They stole all that wealth. Especially those working in financial corporations, and every other billionaire and millionaire and motherfucker has shares in those corporations as well. That's what it is. In order to live, you are forced to take out loans, which are owed to giant financial corporations. We used to have a word for when you owed money to somebody and so therefore had to do work. It was called indentured servitude or serfdom. Interesting to see how such a system has evolved even into 21st century capitalist digital age society. But guys, that's a good spot to transition back to this article I want to read for you and have a little more discussion how we always do about it. Says here, debt is a fact of life, like I was saying. Even as it's proved to be one of the most persistent problems bedeviling our world, your home, your consumer goods, your degree, and if you live in the United States, your medical care. I like how we get a special anecdote there. That makes me feel good as an American. More than likely, all of it was made possible by going into debt. Periodic economic crises have been among the results. Whenever such crises emerge, there have been calls to forgive debt. But the powers that be and an army of commentators warn us that any such efforts have to be limited and measured, lest they lead to chaos and disorder. Now, I want to touch on something quick here. Going back for a minute. Says, among the results have been periodic economic crises. Great Depression was caused from people buying on margin. They borrowed money and then they made risky investments, which was supposed to do a huge yield. The debt bubble with the housing crisis in 2008. I mean, there's just endless amounts of examples throughout all of history, even dating back to Roman times, which we will get into here as well, where when the debt bubble gets too big, when people owe so much debt that they can no longer function within a society, it starts to collapse, right? Now, I was kind of planning on saving this towards the end, but I want to just kind of drive it home now while we have a good segue into it. During the Weimar Republic in Germany, where you always, in history class heard about the hyperinflation, where the inflation was so bad that, a motherfucker would get paid in a wheelbarrow of cash. That wheelbarrow of cash would be enough to maybe get you a loaf of bread. And the inflation was skyrocketing out of control so quickly that, quickly they'd take this fucking wheelbarrow of money, give it to their wife, and then she'd sprint to the fucking store to get basic amenities before it became worthless again, right? And the inflation got to that level because there was two issues. There was a two-pronged debt crisis. One, because of World War I and the harsh reparations that the Western powers put on Germany, there was a large national debt where a lot of the revenue was going to pay back the victims, if you will, the counter-combatants of World War I. So they had this massive national debt, right? Just like we do. We have a massive national debt from financing our overseas wars and all of our other bullshit that the government does. And two, there was a lot of personal debt for Germans because the first debt, the national debt, made it difficult to stimulate the economy, to get jobs, to grow the economy. So everyday working class Germans like you or I had to borrow had a lot of personal debt. So there was two prongs. There was the huge national debt and the huge interpersonal debt, which led to a huge financial crash when the Depression happened as a result of some of the things going on in the United States, which led to a global crash. The Germans were hit exponentially hard, and they had hyperinflation. Now, I want to drive this home. Right now, we are in a situation where because of America's debt rating, its credit rating, so to speak, because it has this huge military, it's able to go all over the world, still has a control over a large sector of markets. The U.S. can borrow as much money as humanly possible. It can just print fucking money and no one says a thing. The debt, our credit rating never goes down because we know even if we aren't good for it, we got a lot of guns and a lot of boats and a lot of airplanes, so you better fucking borrow us the money. Right? We got a huge, a great credit rating that prevents that national debt bubble from popping. That's how we finance all of our empire. That's how we finance all these corporate giveaways, is we have a debt ceiling that just gets higher and higher and higher, and no one stops it because the credit rating's good. So we have that. The only reason it's not an issue is because that debt bubble has not popped, and the countries and the financial institutions that we are borrowing from have not called in the debts. And then obviously, as you know, in your own personal life, we have a huge personal debt bubble. Like all the stuff we talked about, healthcare, auto, personal to pay for expenses, education, all that. We got the same exact pre-existing conditions, if you will, which created the huge hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic. Huge national debt, huge personal debt. I'm going to explain something to you. Like I said, debt is a way of life. It is a culture in our society. When that debt bubble pops, life as you know it is fucking done, my man. The whole system's going to collapse. The supply chains will collapse. Everything will collapse. And it will make the Great Depression look like a bad day on the market, and that's all. So yeah, I just want to touch on that and drive that home here quick. Might have been a good way to end this video on, but you know what? It's important, and it's a concept I've been wanting to try to get across to you guys on previous episodes. Let's go on with this here, guys. In Mesopotamia, an agrarian economy, most debts began to be owed to the palace or the temples. Obligations were paid throughout the year. In the 3rd millennium Sumer or 2nd millennium Babylonia, if you go to a bar during the crop year, you'd run up a tab to the alehouse and to the palace for advances of animals, water, or agricultural inputs, and everything was done by credit. The debts would all be paid on the threshing floor in grain, and a unit of grain was equal to a unit of silver. So that's how society, it was all agrarian society, right? And it was a perpetual cycle of debt. But it worked because you could go to your bar, you could go to your, I don't imagine they had grocery stores, your market, whatever it was, right? And you ran up a tab during the year, which you would pay once you brought in all your grain, all your rice, whatever it was, right? That's how ancient agrarian societies worked. They had a debt cycle, much like how we have, right? But it had limits on it, had expectations on it. Let's go on with this here, guys. But sometimes you would have a crop failure or war or drought, and you couldn't pay. And at that time, like in the laws of Hammurabi, you'd say, if the storm god Hadad comes and ruins the crops, then the debts don't have to be paid. This is how society worked, basically in the 3rd, 2nd, and even into the 1st millennium. When a new ruler took the throne, or when there were other reasons, a war was over, or there was any reason for debt cancellation, you'd cancel the debt. You'd liberate the debt servants to go back to their families. You'd give them back the pledges that they had made, because what would happen if you hadn't wiped out the debts? All of a sudden, all these people that owed debts would become the servants of the person who they owed them to, a wealthy person. So a few things in here, guys. First off, but sometimes you'd have a crop failure or a war or a drought and you couldn't pay. So these ancient societies, these ancient barbaric societies, boy, we were so uncivilized back then. We didn't know shit. We didn't have the scientific method. God, we were half brain dead. These ancient societies realized that when bad shit happens, if people owe money and they have no way to pay it back, they are fucked. And in turn, when people are fucked, your society is fucked. Because you know what? Society is made out of people. I know that's a hard thing to understand in American culture because society is money. That's what matters, is money, not people. People are a way to make money, that's all. These ancient societies who didn't have the scientific method, they don't have any of the understanding of the cosmos or nature or any of this. They had figured out a way, they had understood that if you have too many people owing debt, your society is going to be fucked. When bad shit happened, they forgave the debt because they realized that this person in good faith took out the loan but could not pay it back. Do we have that in the 21st century late stage capitalist United States? Fuck no. You get sick, you got to borrow more money instead of it being canceled. Your car breaks down, you can't get to work, so you lose your job? Not my fucking problem, guy. Not my problem. There's a natural disaster and your house burns down and you just, unfortunately, times were tough already and you missed the fucking insurance payment, so you're not getting anything back from the insurance for your house burning down in a wildfire. Guess what? Them student loans still got to be paid, my man. I got a fucking profit margin to protect. And guess what? With student loans, this is a kicker. I'm sure you guys already know, but this one's real good. Even if you file bankruptcy, which is the closest thing that we have to a debt jubilee, is the embarrassing and humiliating and fucked up process of bankruptcy. Even if you bankrupt, those federal student loans, homie, they got to be paid, bitch. They got to be paid. And one more thing from the segment here. This last part. Because what would happen if you hadn't wiped out the debts? All of a sudden, all these people that owed debts would become the servants of the person they owed them to, a wealthy person. I like that. I like that way of looking at it because I want to be clear here. You don't own your house. The bank does. You don't own your car. The bank does. Okay? You don't, if you owe credit card debt or student loan debt or whatever fucking debt you got, any nice shit you got, this computer, this fucking studio lights, your big screen TV, your boat, whatever. If you owe debt and you don't pay it, they're going to take all your shit. You don't actually own it. If you have debt, you don't actually own the shit. And better than that, my friends, is if you owe debt, they fucking own you. Because guess what? Now you're in a position where you got to work. If you don't work, they're going to take it all. Like we said with that earlier statistic, 8 out of 10 of every dollar we produce goes to some rich asshole. So you're not even working for yourself anymore. Damn. I wish there were a word for what happens or what you call a person that works all the time, but they ain't working for themselves. There should be a word for that. I feel like it should start with an S. I don't know. But yeah, that's what it is. When you are perpetually in debt, when you don't own the things that you've worked for because they don't pay you enough, there's no way you can make it, you're owned by somebody, man. You're owned by somebody. And that's why we have this debt system. That's why they start workers off fresh out of college for technical workers and things like that with huge amounts of debt. Because then guess what, guy? You're already owned by somebody. Everything you do, a percentage of that work is immediately going to a financier. That financier owns you. Seems like a great system to me. All right, guys, let's go on with this, huh? That's what the first sermon of Jesus was all about. When he went to the synagogue and unrolled the scroll of Isaiah, the prophet, and said, "I've come to proclaim the year of the Lord," which was the debt cancellation, the Jubilee year. That was brought in for Babylonia into Judaism, as it was done through all the Near East. People who translated the Bible didn't really know what these words meant. What does it mean, year of our Lord? What does it mean? Deror, which was the debt cancellation. It was only after Assyriologists began to find out all about Near Eastern society had debt cancellation, just like anthropologists were finding their way from the Native American Indians to European realms. You'd have this practice of restoring balance. The idea was, how do we prevent society from destabilizing and polarizing? You cancel the debt. And that's an important note here. How do you prevent society from destabilizing and polarizing? Boy, we've seen a lot of that recently. Destabilizing, supply chain issues, shit's fucked up. People are out of work, people are quitting their jobs, shit's fucked up. You got neo-Nazis in the street. You got communists like me on the internet. Polarizing, going two opposite ways, the polarization of society. That is a direct result of wealth inequality. That is a direct result of the compounding of debt, which has turned all of us into debt peons and which has pitted us against each other. which has polarized us. Because as we are forced to do with less and less and less, we start turning on each other. That's my piece of the pie, you fuck. Get off my pie. Fuck you. This is what debt does. This is what wealth inequality is. Wealth inequality produces debt because the people at the bottom are no longer getting the wealth because it's going to these big papas. So they go into debt, which thereby they owe that debt to the big guys that already have all the money, which increases the wealth inequality. It's a compounding snowball effect, which ends with political polarization and people turning on each other. It's what we're seeing now. I wonder how much better the angry politics would be if you just went like this and snapped away all the debt. If you had millions upon millions of people which are pissed off because 8 out of 10 every dollars they produce is going to some rich asshole. If you just snapped all that away with the debt jubilee, and we could talk about the semantics of how you do that another time. But if you just got rid of all that debt, I wonder how much less fed up and angry and filled with vitriol the average American would be. All right, guys, let's read some more of this. The whole fight of every early society was, how do you prevent the population from falling into bondage? The palaces had a reason for doing this. If you would have the tax-paying small cultivators owing their crop to the creditor and having to go to work on the creditor's land instead of working as a corvée, building palace walls and digging ditches for irrigation, it would have these people fall into debt with the creditors. They wouldn't be able to pay the crop surplus and labor surplus to the palace anymore. The creditors would take over. Now, here's another important one. The parallels between what this guy, I think, what was it, Michael Hudson, the parallels that he's making between ancient society and what's going on now is incredibly important. The whole fight of every early society was, how do you prevent the population from falling into bondage? Then this part right here. If you have people owing their crop to the creditor instead of the palace where they are working, building palace walls and digging ditches for irrigations, if you had these people falling into debt with the creditors, they wouldn't be able to pay the crop surplus and labor surplus to the palace anymore. The creditors would take over. That is exactly what has happened in our society with that process, which I talked about just a little bit ago. Wealth inequality, these people doing policy, which makes wealth inequality go up, right? All that wealth is coming from us on the bottom. It's a wealth transfer. Trickle-down economics really means trickle the fuck up, right? So you got wealth inequality growing, which causes people at the bottom to have to borrow money from the same guys that are already getting richer in order to finance their own lives, right? That, like we said with political polarization, also eats away at civic society. Wealth inequality, as a general rule, eats away at civic society. Because these people on top, they never have enough. We compared them to fucking heroin addicts before, haven't we? It's never enough. So they start deregulating. They start letting infrastructure collapse. Because you're no longer paying taxes to a government which is doing the job for the people, doing the job of running a society. You're paying all your wealth to creditors. And the taxes you are getting out isn't going to build up the society. It isn't going to the programs that are needed to run a society. It's going back to the same people that have you in debt bondage. This comparison here where the crop was owed to the creditor and not to the palace being the government of that time. It's incredibly relevant to the sort of system we've created now. Where, let's be real, the top 1%, the financiers, 6 giant financial corporations own everything, including the palace. That's what this is. This is the sort of society we've created, and it's a process we've seen time and time again, and you'd think we'd learn the lesson. But we seem not to have. Got some more here for you guys. Rulers throughout the Near East, all the way into probably the early kings of Rome, said, the one thing we've got to do is prevent the creditor class from becoming an independent oligarchy. We don't have that here, do we? I hope not. Because if it becomes independent of us and it gets the economic surplus, they're going to use this labor to hire an army, they're going to overthrow us, and they're going to become the state. And that process has been going on for so long in the United States, I don't think most people nowadays realize, unless they have the historical and socioeconomic background of study to understand it, that process has been going on for so long that it's already done. Like I said, the financial corporations own the government, and the government's the one with the army. The financial corporations and the extractive corporations, big oil, lithium, manufacturers, all that. The capitalist class owns the government. Everyone blame the government. The government do this. Why do you think the government is bad? Why do you think that the government doesn't seem to reflect your interests? It's because the capitalist class, the creditor class, like it says right here, has bought it, has usurped it. Oh, they didn't do it with swords and guns and shit. They didn't have to. They bought it wholesale. And now you have a government that reflects the interests of these people. It has become an organ. It has become an organ of the capitalist class. The government has the army, right? It can do the wars. It puts you in your place if you act up and start a riot. The government does that. It's got the army, it's got the police. But guess who's got the government? The creditor class. You don't live in a democracy, man. You live in a creditor oligarchy, just like the Romans did. And that's a fact. It's not up for debate. It's the reason why the government sucks, is because some asshole owns it. And you know what? The government's doing its job, the job he paid it to do. Keep us dumb fucks in our place. Make sure we keep our hoe in the dirt. Make sure no one starts acting up. Make sure that we have all the wars so that he gets profit from his extractive industries overseas, from his corporations that have contracts with the bullets and the guns and the planes and all that shit. The whole thing is one giant racket, and the government is the administrative organ of the folks on top. Let's go on here with a little bit more of a history lesson, huh? In Rome, the wrong kings were overthrown in about 509 BC by an oligarchy, who essentially wanted to reduce the rest of the Roman population to serfdom. The whole republic was a long set of one revolt after another, wanting a debt cancellation and redistribution of land. All of this was called democracy. A democracy to the oligarchy means all the creditors are equal, and therefore liberty is the liberty to enslave the rest of the population. You know, Vladimir Lenin had a great quote about this as well. He said, democracy in bourgeois capitalist society equates to what it meant for the ancient slave-holding nation states of Greece and Rome. It is democracy for the wealthy. It is democracy for the slaveholder and bondage for everybody else. And I'm paraphrasing. But Jesus Christ, you'd think if enough people throughout history had told you the same thing over and over again, you might listen. But then again, I know nobody reads anymore. Nobody reads anymore. This is a great example. I draw a lot of parallels between Rome, ancient Rome and the modern U.S. because even the founding fathers envisioned the American Republic as being the new embodiment of Rome. I mean, a lot of our early architecture reflected that, our legal institutions and things like that as well. But I love this quote here. The whole republic was one long set of revolt after another, wanting a debt cancellation, redistribution of land. If that ain't the American Republic's story of history as well, then I don't know what is. That's the whole story of this country. It's not about what you think it's about. It's not about a bunch of guys loved democracy and they got together. It was a bunch of guys that were wealthy as fuck. They were slave traders. They had what was the equivalent of giant corporations back then, and they didn't want to owe to the state anymore, so they overthrew that state and formed their giant Ponzi scheme on these shores. And all of our history, from civil rights to Occupy Wall Street to the labor movements of the late 19th century and early 20th century, has all been a story of the plebeians resisting the rule of the patricians. The proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. Call it whatever the fuck you want, man. That's been the whole story. Is little guy versus big guy. And it doesn't seem like we're getting too far. Does it? Same old story heard 1,000 times. If there be a God, he's just watching like, dude, you guys haven't figured this out yet? Do I got to send another flood? I don't want to send another flood. I'm getting old and tired. But here we are. We're reliving the same exact fucking crises and cycles as ancient Rome. Discouraging, Democracy throughout antiquity meant serfdom for most of the population. Aristotle was very clear on this. He said, many cities have constituents that appear to be democracies, but really they're oligarchies. And in fact, every democracy, Aristotle wrote, tends to turn into an oligarchy as wealthy people get rich, and then the oligarchy makes itself into a hereditary aristocracy and lords itself over the rest of society. Again, very familiar. Very familiar. Do we have that? Many cities have constituencies which appear to be democracies, but they're really oligarchies. Did you choose Joe Biden? Like, in your heart. Did you choose Hillary Clinton? In your heart? Where along the way did you really have a democratic say? You didn't. You didn't. I'll tell you what they did is the rich people on top bought up all the parties, the Democrats, the Republicans. They bought it all up. They infiltrated it everywhere. They infiltrated the regulatory agencies in the government. Then they bought all the news media. That's something you should know if you don't know. 6 giant corporations, just like there's 6 financial corporations, own everything you fucking see and hear and read. They own CNN. They own Disney. They own all of it, man. Everything that you are taught to believe is pushed on you by somebody that owns that media. And so what do? They want you to make you think you live in a democracy and you got rights. So then they go on the news media and they push this face. You see that face a million times. Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Trump. Ooh, 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 ooh. You see it every day. Every day. Look, these are the guys. These are the guys in charge. See them? And it's like a hammer in your brain. Oh, yeah, I see them. I see them. I see them. Until eventually you believe that you chose it. There's a phrase for that. It's called manufacturing consent. And that's how, even though we live in an oligarchy, you go to the voting booth and you feel like you live in a democracy. But you don't. Because you don't own the land. You don't own the factories. You don't really choose who sits in the fucking city council meetings. You don't choose any of it. But they make you feel like you did. There's the same in ancient Greek societies. We tout about all the time about Greek democracy, cradle of Western civilization. It's all bullshit, man. The historians now say, well, boy, the Roman Empire wasn't all that bad. Look at how rich it got. Ooh, have you heard that before? Let me replace Roman Empire with the United States. Well, boy, the United States wasn't all that bad. Look at how rich it got. Richest country in the world. Oh, yeah, we've heard it. Interesting. But the richness was all concentrated in the 1% of the population, and the 99% ended up being tied down to the land. Are you tied down to the land? Do you get to go do whatever you want, or do you got to live near your work? The factory, the retail outlet, the warehouse, the place where they park the trucks. You're tied to the land just like a serf was. If you read the late books of the New Testament, all the way through the book of Revelation, it's all about we're living in the end times. It's terrible. Rome is the beast. And there's no hope here. We can't reform land. We can't cancel the debts over because of the greed of the rich. There's nothing to do but become martyrs and die and hope that in the next world things are going to be better. And maybe Jesus will come back. That would be great. That whole idea was anti-Roman. Oh, man, that was depressingly similar to sort of things that we hear today, isn't it? Rome is the beast. There's no hope here. We can't reform the land. We can't cancel the debts, all because of the greed of the rich. Boy, it would be nice if Jesus came back and started swinging that whip at these rich fucks. Damn, I'd love that. And this is for those Christians out there that have bought into the prosperity gospel. You don't get to be a Christian and buy into the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel that if you do the work of Jesus and hate blacks and browns, you will get rich, is so antithetic to what Jesus Christ taught. If that's what you think and believe, if you go to one of these mega churches, you're not a fucking Christian, fuck you, and fuck your mother too. That's what it is. What did Jesus do? He was with lepers, the sick. He fed people, prostitutes. He didn't judge anybody. He got everybody together. Said, cancel the debt. Help the rich and poor. I don't know how many fucking Bible verses, if you call yourself a Christian, you can look over where he's like, feed the hungry and the poor and help the sick. When a prosperity gospel Christian reads that shit, he just goes, oh. Doesn't see that part. But then he'll go back to Leviticus, Old Testament, where it says, thou who lays with a man shall be stoned to death, and meanwhile the actual Greek said that those who lay with a little boy will be stoned to death. Misinterpretation. Jesus had nothing to do with Leviticus, guy. That shit thousands of years old. Anyway, let's read a little more of this here. Every economy is going to be planned by someone. I love this one. The question is it going to be planned by the creditors, as it happens to be today? Or are you going to have a government, a ruler, that is going to say, my job is to keep society stable and to prevent it from polarizing so that we can survive and be resilient and go forward? The creditors don't care about resilience. Their time frame is rather short. The tendency of any economy that has an interest-bearing debt is a debt growing faster than the economy as a whole. Like I said, we're in a situation like that right now. You have exponential debt doubling every so many years. We are in that situation right now. And economies have never been able to keep up with it. The tendency of debt for any family, any corporation, any economy is to grow faster than the ability to pay until there's a crash. I'm looking forward to that big one, boys and girls. And when you can't pay, either you lose the property or you become in one way or another a servant to your creditor in terms of having to pay labor, having to pay whatever you produce. You have a concentration of property ownership in the hands of the creditors. If you don't write off all the debts like ancient societies did, in which used to be the core of ancient religion. Every economy that has interest-bearing debt has to restructure at some point, or else all of the economy will end up being owned by just a teeny group of people at the top, like you had in Rome. That's how the Roman Republic ended up to be the Roman Empire. It becomes centralized. The tendency of any financialized economy is to centralize not only wealth, but by centralizing wealth, you centralize political power and decision-making and ultimately military force in the hands of the financial class. Some real doomsayer shit, huh, guys? You know, this first part I just want to touch on some of the other points. We've been through a whole rigmarole already. But as this political polarization has gone on, we've heard, a lot of talk about capitalism, a lot of talk about fascism, a lot of talk about socialism. A lot of times, people that are anti-socialists will say, I don't want a planned economy, free market. Free market! I read and ran. I love this point here because it says every economy is going to be planned by someone. Every economy is planned. Right now, you live in an economy which has been planned by the top 1%, the creditor class that you owe everything you do to. They are the ones planning the economy right now, and it's not ending up too good for you, is it? We always have a planned economy. The only difference is, do we democratically, as working people, plan the economy for ourselves, or do we let them at the 1%, those on top, plan it for us? And in the end, all of human history has been and will continue to be about that discussion. What sort of planned economy do we want? A planned economy for and by the 1%, or a planned economy for working people everywhere? But yeah, guys, I actually had some more that I wanted to touch on with this video, but unfortunately I had to rush off and get my kid out of daycare before they charge me extra. So this is a topic, if you guys like this video, I'd like to talk about more in the future. Indebtedness, how it affects us, how it affects society as a whole. Drop a comment, guys. Let me know what you think about this video. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with this massive debt bubble? Do you agree with what ancient societies did, having a debt jubilee, or do we need to go one step further? Go ahead, drop a comment, and let me know what you think. But yeah, guys, that's all I have for you. As always, it's great hanging out with you, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Yes, I know.